Today, we're digging into the origin story of a true literary giant. We all know John Milton for Paradise Lost, right? It's one of the greatest epic poems ever written in English. But long before that, he was a young man whose entire life was shaped by intense study, some really big choices, and a world that was about to change forever.
And that's the big question, isn't it? We know the epic masterpiece, but what about the man? What kind of experiences create a mind that could even attempt to, as he put it, justify the ways of God to men? Well, that's exactly what we're going to find out.
So we're going to peel back the layers of Milton's early life. We'll see how his family, his incredible education, and his travels all came together to forge the poet he was always meant to be.
Take a look at this portrait. This is the young John Milton, probably during his college years. You can just see the seriousness there, right? The intensity. Even at this age, he was already deep in the world of classical literature and theology, and that foundation would shape everything he ever wrote.
So where does a story like this even begin? Well, like for so many people, it starts at home. And the home Milton grew up in was this really unique mix of business, art, and very, very serious religious faith.
A huge influence was his dad, who was a successful composer but also a scrivener, which is kind of like a legal copyist and moneylender. So the house wasn't just well off, it was full of culture. And his education? Whoa, it was on another level. From a super young age, he was being tutored in all these languages so he could read the great works in their original form.
This quote from his own brother just paints such a clear picture. This wasn't just some bright kid. This was a young man with an almost unbelievable dedication. We're talking staying up until 1 in the morning studying. In fact, Milton himself later said that these late nights were probably what caused his blindness later in life. Just a tragic price to pay for all that knowledge.
Okay, so after all that intense homeschooling, Milton heads off to Cambridge University. And this is where the path that was kind of laid out for him starts to clash with the path he wants for himself.
As you can see, this was a long haul. He spent more than a decade in formal schooling, all the way through a Master of Arts degree. But the really critical thing here isn't just the degrees he got. It's what he decided to do right after he finished. This right here, this was the pivotal moment of his young life. His entire education, everything he'd worked for, was supposed to lead to a career in the Church of England. But Milton felt hemmed in by it all. So he made this incredibly bold choice. He decided to dedicate his life not to the church, but to poetry.
And did that bet pay off? Oh yeah. The results were immediate and just stunning. In the years right after Cambridge, he produced these absolute masterpieces. He wasn't just learning anymore, he was creating. He was finding that unique voice that blended classical style with these deep Christian ideas.
So he's decided on his life's mission. Now it was time for the final and maybe the most important part of his education, a grand tour of Europe.
I mean, think about it. After all those years with his nose buried in a book in London and Cambridge, he was about to experience the real, living heart of European culture. And this trip? It would end up shaping both his art and his politics in a huge way. His journey kicked off in Paris, the glittering capital of France, and he immediately started moving in some pretty high-powered circles.
He got introduced to Hugo Grotius, who was basically an intellectual rock star of the time. Can you just imagine the conversations between this ambitious young English poet and the world-famous Dutch philosopher? A real meeting of the minds.
But as cool as Paris was, it was Italy, and Florence in particular, that just completely captured his imagination. I mean, this was the city of Dante and Michelangelo. This was the cradle of the Renaissance.
And Milton absolutely thrived there. He was welcomed into all the intellectual groups, sharing his own poetry and debating big ideas. And then came the most famous meeting of his whole trip. He met Galileo, who was old by then and under house arrest. Think about that. The great poet of heaven and hell meets the great astronomer who actually mapped the heavens. That encounter would stick with Milton forever.
From Florence, he kept heading south, down to the ancient power of Rome and the buzzing artistic scene in Naples. And you have to remember, throughout this whole trip, Milton wasn't just a tourist. He was an active participant. He was building his reputation, honing his craft, and soaking up all these rich artistic traditions, like opera. You can bet he was filing away all that grand drama for a little poem he'd write later called Paradise Lost.
But this incredible journey of self-discovery was about to get cut short. While Milton was soaking in Europe's past, the future of his own country was hanging by a thread.
He was actually planning to go on to Greece, the home of the classics he loved. But then he heard what he called the sad tidings of civil war in England. He felt he just couldn't keep traveling while his country was in turmoil. The scholar's tour was over. A much more dangerous chapter was about to begin.
And the shift when he gets back is immediate. He starts tutoring to make a living, but his focus quickly turns outward. That intensely private poet who had spent his whole life in quiet study, he becomes a fierce public writer, diving headfirst into the arguments that were tearing England apart.
And that's where we leave the young Milton. All the pieces are on the board now. The classical knowledge, the poetic fire, the world experience, and now a cause to fight for with his pen. The making of the poet was complete. The making of the legend was just getting started.
Okay, so when I say the name John Milton, what probably comes to mind? Epic poetry, right? Angels and demons clashing in the heavens. But today, we're going to look past the poet to find the radical, the revolutionary, the rebel theologian whose ideas absolutely shook the foundations of 17th century England.
And of course, you can't really talk about Milton without talking about Paradise Lost. I mean, for centuries, this epic poem has basically defined our cultural image of the war in heaven and humanity's fall from grace. It's this grand, sweeping story of Satan's rebellion and the fate of Adam and Eve, a true pillar of Western literature.
But here's the twist. The man who actually wrote this masterpiece, he held some personal beliefs that were way more controversial than his poem lets on. I'm talking about views that, in his time, were considered outright heresy. So let's peel back the layers and discover the radical ideas he was truly willing to fight for. First up, Milton took aim at the entire power structure of the Church of England. He wasn't just suggesting a few small reforms. Nope, he was arguing for a complete overhaul of how people practice their faith. And this was all happening right in the middle of the English Civil War, when religion was at the absolute center of the conflict.
So at the time, the Church of England was this very rigid, top-down hierarchy. You had archbishops and bishops, fixed prayers, state-mandated rituals, the whole shebang. Milton wanted to tear all that down. He argued for a direct personal relationship with God, one guided by your own conscience and a direct reading of the Bible, totally free from government control. For Milton, all those layers of church government and fixed prayers, they weren't aids to faith, they were barriers. In these really fiery pamphlets he wrote, he argued that these structures could actually corrupt a person's soul. He believed the only true authority was Scripture, interpreted by a free and reasoning conscience, no middleman required. And Milton's willingness to challenge authority wasn't just some theoretical thing. It became intensely personal when his own life took a really unexpected turn, and that led him to champion another scandalous idea, the right to divorce. So Milton's personal crisis pretty quickly turned into a public crusade. In 1642, he gets married to Mary Powell. Just a few weeks later, she leaves him. Now, under English law back then, you could only get a divorce for adultery, so he had no way out. So what does he do? He picks up his pen and writes a radical argument for divorce on the grounds of incompatibility, turning his own private misery into a public political battle.
And the reaction was intense. His pamphlets on divorce earned him a notorious reputation. Critics branded him a divorcer and even a polygamist. This just shows you how far outside the mainstream his thinking really was. He was advocating for a level of personal freedom that was simply shocking to his contemporaries. But Milton's willingness to rethink sacred institutions didn't stop with the church or marriage. He went even further, challenging one of the most fundamental Christian doctrines of all: what happens to our souls after we die?
He was a proponent of this belief called mortalism, often known as soul sleeping. See, the standard Christian view was, and still is, that the soul is immortal and goes to heaven or hell immediately after death. Milton disagreed. He argued that the soul isn't separate from the body and that it essentially sleeps or ceases to be conscious when you die.
Here's how he saw it. First, you die, and your entire being, body and soul, enters an unconscious state. Second, you just stay in that state until the end of time, until the last judgment. And third, at the resurrection, Christ raises the whole person, not just a disembodied soul. This view completely eliminates concepts like purgatory and an immediate afterlife.
So what do all these radical ideas about the church, about divorce, about the soul really add up to? Well, they all point to a single, powerful core belief that became the foundation for his most revolutionary political arguments: the absolute necessity
of liberty.
For Milton, the logical conclusion was crystal clear. If an individual's conscience is the ultimate guide, then the government has no business controlling the church. He argued for disestablishment, the complete separation of church and state, as the only way to achieve true religious toleration and protect that sacred individual conscience.
And this right here brings us to his most enduring legacy. In his work Areopagitica, which was a fiery defense of free expression, written to protest censorship by Parliament, he wrote these immortal words. For Milton, the freedom to think, to speak, and to debate, especially about the most important matters of faith and life, that was the highest liberty of all.
So the next time you think of John Milton, remember the rebel behind the poetry. The man who challenged the church, redefined marriage, and reimagined the afterlife, all in the name of freedom. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How many of the liberties we take for granted today started with a single, stubborn voice arguing against the world?
When you hear the name John Milton, the first thing that probably comes to mind is the epic poem Paradise Lost. But today, we're looking at a totally different side of Milton, the fiery, radical pamphleteer who took on the entire English establishment over a topic that was completely off-limits: divorce. Just for a second, picture it. You're trapped in a marriage that's making you deeply, deeply unhappy. Today, you've got options. But what if there was just no way out? For Milton, this wasn't some thought experiment. This was his life. And for almost everyone in 17th century England, that was the cold, hard reality. Marriage was a one-way street with no exit ramps. The very idea of dissolving it was basically unthinkable. So let's get into why things were so incredibly rigid. To really get why Milton's ideas caused such an explosion, we first have to understand just how locked down the laws were. It was, for all intents and purposes, a marriage trap. This comparison pretty much tells the entire story. See, back in the 1640s, Protestant England was still using old Catholic canon law for marriage. That meant there was literally no formal way to get a divorce. Sure, you could get an annulment, but only for very specific reasons that prove the marriage was never valid to begin with, like impotence. Now, compare that to today, where no-fault divorce, ending a marriage just because you're incompatible, is a pretty standard idea. The historian Lawrence Stone really hit the nail on the head. He called it the worst of all worlds. You can just feel the hopelessness in that description. It was a legal and religious dead end for so many people. So what would push a celebrated poet to dive right into this incredibly dangerous debate? Well, as it so often happens, the political suddenly became very, very personal. So here's what happened. In 1642, Milton gets married to Mary Powell. And just a few weeks into the marriage, she leaves him, deserts him. This was absolutely the immediate spark for his pamphlets. But what's really fascinating is that this wasn't just some knee-jerk reaction. If you look at his private notebooks, you can see he'd already been thinking deeply about marriage and divorce long before his own life fell apart. So, fueled by his own personal crisis and these deep-seated intellectual beliefs, Milton didn't just argue for a small tweak in the law. No, he went for the whole shebang. He proposed a complete redefinition of what marriage is even for. And this, right here, is the absolute heart of his argument. For Milton, the main purpose of marriage wasn't making babies or just avoiding sin, which were the traditional answers. No, for him, it was about companionship, an apt and cheerful conversation to fight off the loneliness of life. I mean, think about that. In the 17th century, that was a truly revolutionary idea.
And if you buy his first point, then his next one makes perfect sense. He's basically saying, look, if the whole point is companionship, then being stuck with someone you have nothing in common with, a mismatch of dispositions, as he put it, that leads to unspeakable wearisomeness and despair. Well, that marriage has already failed its most fundamental purpose. So he argued, simple incompatibility should be enough to end it.
And he didn't just fire off one pamphlet and call it a day. Oh no. This was a sustained 3-year campaign. First, he drops the bombshell, The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, laying out his whole case. When that caused a massive uproar, he tried a different tactic, appealing to authority by translating the work of a respected reformer. Then he went full scholar with Tetrachordon, a super dense analysis of the Bible. And finally, he just let loose with Calasterian, a blistering personal attack on one of his critics. So, as you can probably guess, arguing for no-fault divorce in the 1640s did not exactly make him popular. The reaction was swift, it was personal, and it was overwhelmingly hostile. The sources on this are crystal clear. His writings were met with nothing but hostility. We're talking preachers denouncing him by name in sermons given directly to Parliament. We're talking a flood of pamphlets attacking him in print. He had touched the rawest of nerves, and the establishment was hitting back hard. And here is where the story takes this amazing, almost ironic twist. All those attempts to shut him down, to censor and ban his divorce tracts, directly led Milton to write his most famous and powerful piece of prose ever, Areopagitica. It's this legendary, passionate defense of free speech and a free press. So the backlash against one radical idea actually gave birth to another that would change the world. So after all that fire and fury, did Milton's one-man crusade actually accomplish anything? Well, the answer is, it's complicated. He didn't win the war, but he absolutely changed the terms of the debate. Yeah, Milton took his case right to the top. He actually went before the Westminster Assembly, the very group of religious leaders that Parliament had tasked with reforming church doctrine. He stood there and argued that divorce should be a private matter of conscience, not a public crime. And this table really shows you the outcome. On the left, you've got what Milton was fighting for, divorce for incompatibility. On the right, what the Assembly finally agreed on. So, no, they didn't go nearly as far as Milton wanted, but, and this is a huge but, they did officially allow for divorce in cases of infidelity and abandonment. This was a major crack in the old wall of canon law. So the crucial takeaway is this. Milton absolutely failed to get the radical law he wanted, but his relentless campaign forced the conversation. He pushed a powerful conservative institution to officially broaden its definition of divorce, cracking open a door that had been sealed shut for centuries. And all of this leaves us with a question that is just as relevant and just as thorny today as it was in Milton's time. What's the ultimate purpose of marriage? Should the law prioritize the sanctity of the institution itself, or should it prioritize the happiness of the people in it? Milton made his radical choice almost 400 years ago, and it's a debate we're all still living with today.